the debt to GDP ratio. Now, this model is very stylized, so there are just two types of fiscal policy that you can adopt. You can use austerity, that is, you can increase the primary surplus today, you can increase taxes today, and this will lower the future debt to GDP ratio. Or you can use a more pro-growth approach. So you can convince people that taxes will be lower in the future. If people believe you, they will invest more, growth will pick up, and that will reduce the debt to GDP ratio. Of course, you would like to get out of fiscal stagnation using pro-growth policy. You would like growth to be higher. But that might not always be possible, especially if the government doesn't have the ability to commit. So let me give you the intuition using an example. You can find a more detailed description of the problem in the paper. So let's imagine that we live in a two-period economy. So in period 0, there is the transition toward the final steady state. In period 1, we land on the final steady state, in which all the fiscal variables and productivity growth are constant. So in this final steady state, the government will keep constant the debt to GDP ratio, and the surplus required to maintain the debt to GDP ratio constant will depend on the rate of productivity growth. So once again, lower growth requires a higher surplus to maintain debt to GDP constant. If the government operates under discretion, the equilibrium might not be unique, for the same reason that I told you before when I studied the constant debt policy. That is, there are some intermediate values of the debt to GDP ratio such that if the private sector is optimistic and it invests and growth is high, then that debt can be sustained using a low primary surplus. But if the private sector is pessimistic and it doesn't invest and growth is weak, maintaining the debt to GDP ratio constant will require a high fiscal surplus and high fiscal distortion. Now, let's assume that agents believe that the economy will enter the good fiscally sound steady state if debt is lower than the bar, and it will enter the fiscal stagnation steady state if debt is higher than the bar. Here, the bar is a way to measure people's expectation. A pessimistic economy is an economy in which the bar is low, so in which you need to reduce debt by a lot to get out of fiscal stagnation. What will happen in period 0? So the equation looks complicated. I have 20 seconds. Let me just give you the intuition. Here, the government would like to attain the fiscally sound steady state. It would like to lower debt to get out of fiscal stagnation. And to do so, in this simple model, the only thing that it can do is to increase taxes today, to run an austerity program. And what it will be optimal for the government to do is to run austerity until debt falls lower than the bar. But whether this happens or not, it will depend on people's expectation. I will take just 1 minute more. Here I'm showing you two economies which have the same fundamentals. The government is behaving optimally in both cases, but one economy is an optimistic economy, the blue line. Here people believe that they will get out of fiscal stagnation even at relatively high level of debt. The red line is a pessimistic economy in which people believe that debt will have to fall by a lot to get out of fiscal stagnation. And you see, even though the fiscal adjustment, the primary surplus that the government runs is higher in the pessimistic economy, the government doesn't get out of fiscal stagnation. In the optimistic economy, it does. Why? Because in the optimistic economy, the private sector starts to invest, and higher growth contributes to lowering the public debt to GDP ratio, so it contributes to jumpstart the economy out of fiscal stagnation. So what this tells you, and I will conclude here, is that to get out of fiscal stagnation, what the government needs is a combination of fiscal action, but also movement from the private sector. So to get out of fiscal stagnation, you want the private sector to come with you. You want to spur private investment, so that helps you to reduce the public debt to GDP ratio. But that may not be possible if the government cannot commit to its future action. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Luca. Xavier, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I would like to thank the organizers, especially for assigning me this paper, because I like it a lot. So I may not have a lot of contributions and criticism to make, but anyway, thank you. Frankly, as head of economics and research in a central bank, I would make this paper a compulsory reading to all my staff. Why? Because I keep telling my staff, guys, you want to do research, it's fine, but please make it relevant. And this is a perfect example of frontier research meeting first-order policy issues. I'm not going to summarize the paper. He did a great job at presenting it. But I'm just going to share with you 4 thoughts that came up when I read the paper. First, it belongs to a class of arguments cautioning against looking at fiscal policy only through the lenses of debt arithmetics. And it basically belongs to a class of arguments which we've seen before. Well, in 2008-9, I was at the IMF. And the argument was entirely, of course, the IMF, it's entirely Keynesian, but the argument was, oh, all right, the fiscal multiplier can be above 1. If my debt is above 100% of GDP, in the short term, I will basically kill myself, or I will basically raise my debt ratio if I try to cut spending or raise taxes, because the fiscal multiplier is making sure that my denominator is going to fall by less than my numerator. So, you know, we've seen that kind of argument. It's been there. But what I like about this, this paper is that now the argument is not just short-term Keynesian stuff. It's actually a long-term argument. Primary surpluses can only be achieved through greater distortions in the economy, which leads to lower growth, which in turn requires higher surpluses to tame the debt dynamics. And if you're unlucky, and these days there are reasons to believe that bad luck is around the corner, you end up in a bad steady state characterized by high debt and low productivity growth. The second thought that came up when I read the paper was this paper written about 15 years ago by Eric Leeper, I think. And Eric was basically comparing monetary policy science or monetary science to fiscal alchemy. And I think that you do a great job at trying to bring science into alchemy. And why do I use that word? Not just because a great guy like Leeper used it before, but also because actually, you know, if you compare the lead of public debt and the gold of prosperity, well, basically, there is something about alchemy here, and you're trying to unpack all this, and that's nice. The third thought, is about the immediate policy relevance of the paper. I can perfectly imagine myself talking to some economist working for Donald Trump's Council of Economic Advisor and saying, great, I have a paper that actually rationalizes what we are trying to do with the One Big Beautiful Bill. You know, the One Big Beautiful Bill is entirely about a growth agenda. I asked one of those economists, whose name I will not disclose, of course, and I knew the guy from before, and he is really, you know, a guy who is aware of what that sustainability means. And he told me, Xavier, you don't understand. It's a growth agenda, and we're going to grow, and that is going to be sustainable again. The fourth thought is that, and this is close to my heart, credibility matters. Credibility is actually the most valuable, intangible asset in the hands of policymakers, any policymakers. And credibility is critical given a very classic, I would say, time inconsistency problem that you have in your model when you try to tax the returns of investments. So this begs the question from the practitioner's point of view, because that's where I'm coming from. This begs the question as to what kind of fiscal framework could actually contain sufficiently fiscal discretion to, to basically get where we need to go in terms of remaining credible and avoiding this time inconsistency problem that your model nicely described. Now, you understand how much I like the paper, so, but I will continue my discussion with two sets of considerations. First set of considerations, pretty nerdy stuff, basically trying to test a little bit about the robustness of the findings that you have. And the second thing is some questions really from the purely practitioner's point of view, which is obviously mine. First, the nerdy stuff. And I start with equation 1, which is the utility function. And you say, well, it's purely based on consumption. Nothing wrong with that. But, basically you completely lose the labor supply. And I'm asking this because at the core of many, economic policy strategies that you have today in Europe, and this is certainly the case in my country, labor market reforms are the core of things. We are really trying to do something with the labor supply. And the labor supply here is completely absent. So I'm wondering, how much do we lose by just making this beautifully simplifying assumption, but how much do we lose there by ignoring the labor supply? The second thing, and I jump 19 equations and I go to the fiscal policy rule 19. You define it in terms of access to non-distortionary taxation, and obviously your S bar, if I remember well, plays a very large role in there. But this makes the story a little bit discomforting to me, because it says, well, if you're lucky enough to be a country with access to non-distortionary taxation, say you're sitting on oil, well, then great. You're fantastic. You're gonna have wonderful productivity growth and things like that. And that doesn't fit with the usual Dutch disease story that I have in mind with resource-rich countries. So I'd like to have a bit, to have your views on that. And in practice, governments, when they when they conduct tax policy, they have a choice between different types of taxes. Some of them are more distortionary than others. And you can choose between raising the marginal rate on PIT or raising VAT. Obviously, one is less distortionary than the other, and I'm just wondering here what the model could have to say about this. Third, it's a bit of a cheap shot. There is no expenditure. And currently, the name of the game in fiscal policy discussions is entirely about expenditure. We need to contain expenditure. There was an entire fiscal monitor dedicated to that. We need to be smart with spending. I truly believe that, but here it's completely absent. Is it just that you can escape that discussion by raising S bar and say, well, it's as if there was some cheap stuff I could do in the budget to avoid these distortions, or is there more to it? My fourth nerdy thought is about the fiscal rule. Obviously, if you invite me, I will have to talk about fiscal rules. And equation 26 is your fiscal rule. It's very classic. It's coming from the famous Bond article in 1998 in the QJE. But when I was at the IMF, I had a boss who was very active in trying to estimate this equation. And basically, you can look at all the panels you want, emerging markets mixed with advanced economies, just emerging markets. It's never linear. It's always cubic. And it's cubic because it means that there is something that you call fiscal fatigue. You cannot assume that governments are going to be able to raise their primary surplus at any level. There is an upper bound on the primary surplus. And if you accept the idea that there is an upper bound on the primary surplus, that means there is a debt limit. That is, there is a debt level beyond which default is absolutely certain. And here again, for simplifying reasons that I fully understand, you completely exclude default. So I'm just wondering to what extent this is really an important thing, or something that we can neglect in the grander scheme of things. The second argument related to that is not just that probably it's cubic, but it's the fact that it's not just the level of the primary balance that matters for fiscal policy. It's actually the footprint of the debt on your budget. It's the interest bill that you pay.